What could possibly make the most powerful executive in the building stop an interview without a single word being spoken? The executive conference room on the 32nd floor overlooked the Boston skyline through walls of glass that reflected the gray clouds drifting across an early autumn morning. Inside, every chair had been perfectly aligned, every resume carefully arranged, every second planned with relentless precision. Nathan Brooks expected nothing less. At 45, he had built one of the nation's fastest-growing technology companies by believing that discipline always outperformed emotion. His employees respected him. Investors trusted him. Competitors feared him. Around the polished walnut conference table sat senior executives, department directors, and recruitment specialists, all waiting for the final candidate of the morning. The interview schedule had already slipped behind by 6 minutes, something Nathan disliked almost as much as excuses. Across the table, a nervous woman in her late 30s folded her hands tightly in her lap. Olivia Bennett wore a simple navy blazer that had clearly been pressed with care, though the sleeves showed the faint signs of years of use. Her resume rested neatly before the hiring committee, but one section had already drawn silent attention. There was a long employment gap spanning several years. Nathan had read hundreds of resumes that week alone. He had learned to recognize patterns before conversations even began. Experience. Education. Stability. Gaps. The interview had remained professional, but he could sense the committee quietly reaching the same conclusion before Olivia finished answering her final question. Nathan glanced once more at the page, preparing to thank her for coming. Then everything changed. The heavy conference room door slowly opened without anyone announcing an interruption. Every head turned at once. Standing quietly in the doorway was a little girl no older than 9. She carried a faded blue backpack that looked almost too large for her small shoulders. Strands of blonde hair had slipped free from her ponytail during what must have been a hurried walk through the city, and her white sneakers carried tiny traces of rain from the sidewalks outside. Her blue eyes searched the room until they found Nathan sitting at the far end of the table. The security staff stationed outside had not expected a child to walk confidently into an executive interview, and for one suspended moment nobody moved. The little girl took one careful step inside the room, holding both backpack straps tightly as though gathering every bit of courage she had left. Olivia immediately stood up, her face filling with surprise. "Sophie," she whispered. The little girl looked toward her mother only briefly before returning her attention to Nathan. "Mom did not know I was coming," she said quickly, her small voice trembling but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Please do not be upset with her." The room became impossibly still. Nathan slowly placed the resume back onto the table without taking his eyes off the child. Sophie swallowed hard before continuing. "I only need 2 minutes. Then I will leave." No one interrupted her. No one reached for the door. Even the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the silence. Sophie carefully removed one folded sheet of paper from the front pocket of her backpack but kept it close against her chest instead of handing it over. "Everyone has been reading my mom's resume," she said softly. "But nobody has read the part that matters most." Nathan felt something unfamiliar settle over the room. It was not disruption. It was expectation. For the first time that morning, the interview was no longer about qualifications or job titles. It had become about a story that no resume had ever learned how to tell. Sophie held the folded paper so carefully that it almost seemed fragile enough to fall apart if anyone reached for it too quickly. She looked around the conference room, her eyes briefly meeting the faces of people dressed in expensive suits before returning to Nathan Brooks. Nobody spoke. Even Olivia remained frozen, unable to decide whether to apologize or simply let her daughter continue. Nathan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the little girl with quiet curiosity instead of frustration. He had spent years leading negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet he could not remember a room becoming this silent because of one child carrying a worn backpack. You said we missed something, Nathan finally said, his voice calm and measured. What is it? Sophie took a slow breath. Everybody keeps looking at the empty years on my mom's resume. She glanced toward the papers spread across the polished conference table. But nobody knows what happened during those years. One of the hiring managers shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another quietly lowered his pen onto his notebook. Nathan looked down at Olivia's resume once again. The employment gap stretched across nearly 5 years. Until that moment, he had seen it only as missing experience. Sophie carefully stepped closer to the table, never raising her voice. My mom did not stop working because she was lazy. She looked toward her mother with a proud smile. She stopped because my grandma got very sick. Olivia lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed that her daughter felt responsible for explaining something she herself had never mentioned. Sophie continued gently. Every morning, my mom helped Grandma get dressed. She made breakfast, took her to doctor appointments, read books to her when she could not sleep, and stayed beside her every day. She paused before quietly adding, she said family comes before everything else. The conference room remained completely still. Nathan noticed several members of the hiring committee exchanging thoughtful glances. The missing years on the resume suddenly looked very different. They were no longer empty. They were simply written in a language that ordinary documents could not capture. Sophie slowly placed the folded paper on the edge of the conference table. This is what I wanted you to read. Nathan reached forward and carefully unfolded it. It was not another resume. It was a handwritten letter in careful blue ink. Across the top, a child's handwriting read, "Things my mom never put on her resume." Nathan continued reading silently. She always keeps her promises. She never complains when life gets difficult. She always helps people before helping herself. She taught me that kindness is never a waste of time. She told Grandma every single day that she was loved. Nathan felt the room grow even quieter. There were no awards listed. No certificates. No professional accomplishments. Only qualities that could never be measured by software or interview scores. He looked up slowly. Did you write this? Sophie nodded. Because my mom said interviews are supposed to tell people who you are. She smiled softly. I thought maybe the paper forgot the best parts. Nathan glanced toward Olivia, whose eyes had begun to fill with quiet emotion. She had not asked her daughter to come. She had not prepared this moment. Yet somehow, the smallest person in the room had just reminded everyone that behind every application was a human life far larger than the pages resting on the table. Nathan gently folded the letter once more, placing it carefully beside the resume instead of on top of it. For the first time that morning, he realized he no longer wanted to ask the next interview question that had been printed on the company's official schedule. No one reached for the conference room door. No one suggested ending the interruption. Instead, every person around the table remained exactly where they were, as though the morning had quietly rewritten its own agenda. Nathan rested both hands on the polished walnut surface before looking at Olivia again, but this time he was no longer studying the resume. He was studying the woman sitting behind it. Her shoulders remained tense, and although she tried to maintain a professional smile, years of carrying responsibility alone had left a quiet exhaustion that no interview suit could completely hide. Nathan broke the silence gently. Mrs. Bennett, did you know your daughter was planning to come here today? Olivia immediately shook her head. No, sir. I am so sorry. I would never have allowed her to interrupt your meeting. She looked toward Sophie with both surprise and concern. She should be in school right now. Sophie lowered her eyes for a brief moment. I went to school first, she answered softly. But I asked the office if I could leave early because today was important. Nathan noticed the honesty in her voice. There was no attempt to manipulate anyone. Only a child who believed that speaking the truth was worth the risk. One member of the hiring committee quietly cleared his throat. Mr. Brooks, perhaps we should continue with the interview schedule. Nathan turned toward him, then looked once more at the handwritten letter resting beside Olivia's resume. We are continuing the interview, he replied calmly. Only not in the way we expected. The room became still again. Nathan folded his hands together. Mrs. Bennett, may I ask you something that is not listed on your resume? Olivia nodded. Of course. He glanced briefly at the employment gap before meeting her eyes again. What was the hardest part of those 5 years? Olivia remained silent for several seconds. She was clearly searching for the right words rather than the impressive ones. Finally, she answered quietly. Watching someone you love slowly lose the ability to do the simplest things while trying to make every day feel normal for them. Nobody interrupted. There were mornings when my mother could still smile, Olivia continued. There were afternoons when she forgot my name. Every day was different, but she deserved to feel safe no matter what kind of day it was. Nathan listened without taking notes. For perhaps the first time in years, he realized he was not evaluating an applicant. He was listening to a human story. Olivia smiled faintly toward Sophie. I kept telling my daughter that one day life would settle down again. I wanted her to believe that kindness was still worth choosing, even when nobody was watching. Sophie looked at her mother with unmistakable admiration. Nathan noticed it immediately. Children often revealed the truth adults accidentally hid. The respect in Sophie's eyes could not be rehearsed. It had been earned through countless ordinary days. Nathan reached toward the resume once more. You never mentioned any of this in your application. Olivia gave a gentle smile. Because I did not think anyone hiring employees wanted to read about caregiving. I thought they only wanted experience that came with job titles. Nathan slowly shook his head. Maybe that is where we have been asking the wrong questions. He looked around the conference table. Every executive was now paying attention in a way no interview manual could ever teach. The conversation had quietly shifted away from employment history and toward character, resilience, and responsibility. Sophie reached into her faded blue backpack once more, her small hands carefully searching for something else. She looked at Nathan with quiet confidence before saying, There is one more thing my mom forgot to bring. I think it belongs in the interview too. Sophie slowly pulled a small rectangular object from the front pocket of her faded blue backpack, holding it with both hands as though it deserved the same care as something priceless. She walked toward the conference table until she stood beside her mother's chair, then gently placed the object in front of Nathan Brooks. It was not another letter or certificate. It was an old employee identification badge. The plastic edges had become worn with time, and the company logo printed across the top belonged to a regional customer service company that had closed several years earlier. Olivia immediately recognized it and quietly covered her mouth with one hand. Sophie, she whispered. I thought we lost that. Sophie smiled softly. You did not lose it. I kept it. Nathan carefully picked up the badge. Olivia Bennett. Customer Support Specialist. Employee of the Year. The photograph showed a younger version of the woman now sitting across from him, smiling with unmistakable confidence. Attached to the back of the badge was a folded yellow note secured with clear tape. Nathan looked toward Sophie. May I? She nodded. He unfolded the note carefully. In neat handwriting, it read, Never forget that every customer remembers how you made them feel, long after they forget what you said. Nathan looked back at Olivia. Who wrote this? Olivia smiled through quiet emotion. My first supervisor. He handed me that note after my first year with the company. Sophie gently rested one hand on the badge. Mom keeps saying she has not worked for 5 years. She looked around the room. But she still helps everybody. Nathan listened silently. Sophie continued, She helped Grandma every day. She helps my neighbors when they need groceries. She reads books to the little kids at church on Saturdays. She even helped my teacher organize the school library during summer break. Olivia quickly shook her head. Those were just small things. Sophie turned toward her mother with the innocent honesty only a child could possess. They were big to the people you helped. The room became quiet once again. Nathan slowly placed the employee badge beside the resume and the handwritten letter. 3 different pieces of paper now rested together on the polished conference table. One described professional experience. One described character. One quietly proved both had existed all along. Nathan noticed something he had overlooked earlier. The resume measured only employment. The badge measured trust. The letter measured love. None of them contradicted one another. Together they completed the story. One of the directors sitting farther down the table spoke softly. "Mrs. Bennett, why did you never include volunteer work or caregiving experience in your application?" Olivia answered with complete honesty. "Because I assumed employers would see those years as time away from real work." Nathan lowered his eyes for a moment before looking toward every executive seated around him. "Perhaps we have been defining real work too narrowly." Nobody argued. Nobody reached for another resume. The atmosphere inside the conference room had shifted completely. This was no longer a conversation about qualifications alone. It had become a conversation about what kind of people the company wanted to trust with its future. Sophie quietly zipped her backpack closed before looking back at Nathan. "My mom says jobs help people earn a living." She smiled gently. "But good people help places become better." Nathan felt those simple words settle deeply inside him. He realized that every document spread across the conference table had been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking whether Olivia Bennett had spent 5 years away from work, perhaps the better question was what those 5 years had taught her that no office ever could. For several quiet moments, Nathan Brooks did not ask another interview question. Instead, he looked at the 3 items resting side by side on the polished conference table. The resume spoke about employment. The handwritten letter spoke about character. The old employee badge spoke about trust earned long before anyone in this room had met Olivia Bennett. Together, they painted a portrait far more complete than any application software could ever produce. Nathan slowly closed the leather portfolio containing the prepared interview questions. The movement immediately caught the attention of everyone seated around the table. They had worked with him long enough to recognize that he rarely abandoned a planned agenda. "Mrs. Bennett," he said calmly, "I would like to ask a different question." Olivia straightened in her chair, surprised by the gentle tone in his voice. "Of course." Nathan folded his hands together. "When you wake up each morning, what makes you keep trying even after everything your family has been through?" Olivia remained silent for several seconds. Her answer did not come quickly because she was not searching for the perfect response. She was searching for the truthful one. Finally, she smiled towards Sophie before speaking. "Because every morning my daughter deserves to believe that hope is something adults protect, not something children have to carry alone." The words settled quietly across the conference room. One recruitment manager lowered his eyes toward his notebook without writing anything. Another executive leaned back slowly, listening with complete attention. Nathan remained focused on Olivia. "Were you ever afraid that stepping away from your career would mean you could never return?" Olivia nodded honestly. "Every day." She took a careful breath before continuing. "But when someone you love needs you, there are moments when you stop asking what your career will become and start asking who you want to become." Nathan could not remember hearing an interview answer that sounded less rehearsed and more meaningful. There were no polished corporate phrases. No carefully memorized leadership principles. Only lived experience. Sophie quietly listened beside her mother, gently holding one strap of her faded blue backpack. She did not interrupt. She did not need to. Everything she had hoped to say was already becoming visible inside the room. Nathan looked around the conference table. Does anyone have another question for Mrs. Bennett? A senior director who had remained silent throughout the interview finally spoke. Yes. He smiled warmly toward Olivia. If you joined our company, how would your experience caring for your family make you a better teammate? Olivia's eyes brightened with quiet confidence. This was the first question that allowed her to speak about the years everyone had once considered empty. Caregiving taught me patience, she answered. It taught me how to stay calm during uncertainty, how to solve unexpected problems without panic, how to listen before speaking, and how to treat every person with dignity, even on their hardest day. She smiled softly. Those lessons did not come from an office, but I believe they belong in every workplace. Nathan noticed several members of the committee nodding almost instinctively. The conversation no longer felt like an interview designed to eliminate candidates. It felt like a discussion about the qualities that truly strengthened an organization. Sophie reached into her backpack one final time and quietly removed a colorful drawing folded neatly in half. She placed it beside the employee badge without saying anything. Nathan unfolded it carefully. It showed a woman helping an elderly grandmother while a little girl smiled nearby beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, written in careful crayon letters, were the words, "My mom never stopped going to work. She just worked where love needed her most." Nathan looked at the drawing for a long moment before lifting his eyes toward Olivia. In that simple picture, created by a child who had witnessed every difficult year with her own eyes, he realized the interview had stopped being about filling a position long ago. It had quietly become an opportunity to reconsider what true experience really looked like. Nathan remained seated. Long after the conversation should have ended. The conference room, once governed by schedules and evaluation forms, now felt remarkably different. The resumes stacked neatly beside every executive suddenly seemed incomplete, as though each one might be hiding stories no software could ever recognize. Nathan slowly gathered the handwritten letter, the employee badge, and Sophie's colorful drawing into a careful stack instead of returning them to the backpack immediately. He looked toward the recruitment director seated across the table. May I ask everyone a question? Heads nodded around the room. Nathan leaned forward slightly. How many applications did we reject this month because of employment gaps? The recruitment director opened his laptop and quietly searched through the company's hiring dashboard. After several moments, he answered. 312. Nathan looked at him again. How many of those candidates were rejected before speaking with a person? The room became silent once more. The director hesitated before answering honestly. Most of them. Nathan slowly stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city below. Thousands of people hurried through the streets, each carrying responsibilities invisible to everyone around them. He had always believed the company's hiring process was efficient because it removed emotion from decision-making. For years, he had celebrated the speed of the automated screening system. Now, standing before the glass, he wondered how many remarkable people had quietly disappeared behind one unchecked box labeled employment gap. He turned back toward the conference table. Mrs. Bennett, when you submitted your application, did anyone ask why those 5 years were missing? Olivia shook her head gently. No. The application only asked for dates. Nathan nodded slowly. So the system reached a conclusion before anyone asked your story. Olivia smiled sadly. I assumed that was simply how hiring worked now. Nathan looked toward every executive in the room. Perhaps that is exactly what needs to change. Nobody disagreed. One senior vice president spoke carefully. The automated filter was designed to reduce workload. Nathan answered calmly. It also reduced opportunities for people we never truly met. He returned to his chair before sliding Olivia's resume toward the center of the table. Today, a 9-year-old reminded us that a missing line on paper does not mean missing character. Several committee members quietly nodded. Nathan pressed the intercom button beside his seat. Within moments, the Human Resources Director entered the conference room, expecting the interview to be finished. Instead, Nathan handed her Olivia's resume together with the handwritten letter, the employee badge, and Sophie's drawing. I would like every candidate with significant employment gaps from this hiring cycle reviewed by an actual person before receiving a final decision. The director looked surprised. Every application? Nathan smiled gently. Every story deserves someone willing to listen before deciding it has nothing left to offer. Sophie looked toward her mother with bright eyes, not fully understanding corporate policies but recognizing hope when she saw it. Olivia quietly reached for her daughter's hand beneath the conference table. Nathan noticed the small gesture and realized that no leadership seminar had ever taught him as much about responsibility as this unexpected interview had in a single morning. He looked at Sophie and smiled warmly. You asked us to read the page everyone skipped. Sophie nodded. Nathan carefully placed the handwritten letter back into her backpack himself. Thank you for making sure we finally did. The conference room gradually emptied, but Nathan Brooks remained standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows long after everyone else had returned to their offices. Below, the city continued moving with its usual rhythm, unaware that one unexpected conversation had quietly challenged years of company policy. The Human Resources Director returned less than an hour later carrying a tablet filled with reports Nathan had never asked to see before. You wanted the numbers, she said. Nathan nodded and invited her to sit. She opened the first report. During the past 18 months, our automated screening system rejected 2,471 applicants before they ever reached an interview. Nathan listened carefully. How many were rejected primarily because of employment gaps? She scrolled through the data. 836. Nathan remained silent. The number was far larger than he had expected. The director continued. Many had paused their careers to care for children, aging parents, spouses recovering from illness, or family members with disabilities. Others returned to school or volunteered in their communities. Nathan slowly folded his hands. Did anyone ever review those applications personally? The director hesitated before answering. Only if someone inside the company specifically requested it. Otherwise, the software automatically removed them from consideration. Nathan looked once again at Olivia's resume lying beside Sophie's handwritten letter. If a little girl had not walked into the conference room that morning, Olivia's application might have quietly disappeared like hundreds of others before it. The realization unsettled him more than any disappointing quarterly report ever had. Later that afternoon, Nathan requested a meeting with the engineering team responsible for designing the company's hiring platform. The lead software architect projected the recruitment workflow onto a large screen. Colored charts explained how candidates moved through each stage of evaluation. Nathan listened until one small decision box appeared near the center of the diagram. Employment gap greater than 24 months. Automatic rejection. Who approved this rule? Nathan asked calmly. The room became quiet. Finally, one senior manager answered. It was introduced several years ago to improve efficiency and reduce manual reviews. Nathan studied the screen for several long moments. Did anyone ever test whether the rule eliminated qualified people? Another silence followed. No one could answer with certainty. The engineer quietly admitted, we measured processing speed. We never measured who we might have been missing. Nathan nodded slowly. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. Then we optimized the wrong result. He walked toward the screen and pointed directly at the highlighted decision box. This line assumes every gap means someone stopped growing. He looked around the room. Today I met a woman who spent 5 years developing patience, resilience, compassion, problem-solving, crisis management, and leadership inside her own family. The engineers listened without interruption. Nathan continued. Our system treated those years as though they never existed. The room fell completely silent. Finally, one young software developer spoke quietly from the back of the conference room. My father left his career for 3 years to care for my grandfather. He probably would not pass this filter either. Several others exchanged thoughtful glances. Nathan realized the issue reached far beyond one applicant or one interview. Hidden behind thousands of lines of code were assumptions about what counted as valuable experience. Before leaving the meeting, Nathan gave only one instruction. Tomorrow morning I want every automatic rejection rule reviewed by people instead of software alone. Technology should help us understand human potential. It should never replace the responsibility to look for it. As the meeting ended, Nathan slipped Sophie's colorful drawing into the folder beside Olivia's resume. The little girl's simple picture had accomplished something months of executive reports never had. It had exposed a flaw that numbers alone could not reveal because sometimes the smallest voice was the first one willing to ask whether the system itself needed an interview. 3 weeks later, the executive conference room looked almost the same, yet everything about it felt different. The polished walnut table remained in its place. The floor-to-ceiling windows still overlooked the Boston skyline. The morning sunlight still poured across neatly arranged folders. But one important detail had quietly disappeared. No stack of applications had been separated by an invisible line labeled employment gap before anyone entered the room. Nathan Brooks stood beside a large presentation screen while department leaders, recruiters, software engineers, and hiring managers filled every seat. Behind him appeared a single sentence instead of charts or financial projections. Every application deserves a human conversation before a final decision. Nathan looked around the room before speaking. 3 weeks ago, I believed our hiring process reflected fairness because every applicant followed the same rules. He paused. Now I understand that treating everyone the same is not always the same as seeing everyone fairly. The room remained completely attentive. The Human Resources Director introduced the updated hiring process. Automated software would continue organizing applications, but it could no longer reject candidates based solely on employment gaps. Every applicant whose career included caregiving, military service, education, volunteer work, or family responsibilities would receive an individual review by trained hiring specialists before any final decision. The room responded with quiet approval rather than applause. Everyone understood this was not simply a policy change. It was a change in perspective. Later that afternoon, Olivia Bennett returned to the same conference room. This time she carried no visible anxiety. Sophie walked beside her wearing the same faded blue backpack, though today it seemed noticeably lighter. Nathan greeted them personally at the doorway instead of waiting behind the conference table. Thank you both for coming back, he said warmly. Sophie smiled. This time I waited until school was over. Nathan laughed softly. I appreciate that. Olivia looked around the room with quiet amazement. It feels different in here. Nathan nodded. Because it is. He invited them to sit before placing a folder in front of Olivia. Our hiring committee completed a full review of your qualifications. Olivia listened silently, her hands resting gently together. Nathan continued. Your previous customer service experience, leadership under pressure, communication skills, and the resilience you demonstrated during your years of caregiving convinced every member of the committee that you would strengthen this company. He slid the folder toward her. Mrs. Bennett, we would be honored if you accepted our offer to join Hayes Technologies. Olivia stared at the folder for several seconds before opening it with careful hands. Tears gathered quietly in her eyes, but her smile remained steady. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for the opportunity. Thank you for seeing more than the dates. Nathan smiled gently. You helped us realize we were measuring the wrong things. Sophie looked from her mother to Nathan before asking the question only a child would think to ask. Does this mean other moms get another chance too? Nathan looked directly at her before answering. Yes. He pointed toward the presentation screen still visible through the open conference room doors. Because of what happened here, every applicant with a story behind their resume will now be heard before any decision is made. Sophie smiled so brightly that several employees standing nearby smiled with her. She quietly opened her backpack and removed the colorful drawing she had shown during the interview weeks earlier. Nathan expected her to take it home. Instead, she handed it to him. I think you should keep it now, she said. Nathan accepted the drawing carefully, looking once again at the childlike picture of a mother helping her family beneath a bright yellow sun. This time he understood it represented far more than one family. It represented every story that deserved to be seen beyond the empty spaces on a page, reminding everyone in the building that compassion was not the opposite of excellence. It was one of the reasons excellence could truly exist. 6 months later, the 32nd floor looked much the same from the outside, but the spirit inside Hayes Technologies had quietly transformed. New employees filled the hallways, conversations drifted through bright collaborative spaces, and framed photographs celebrating volunteer projects and community partnerships now hung beside awards for innovation and business growth. Nathan Brooks often paused before entering his office each morning, reminded that success had become more meaningful when it included people whose stories once might have been overlooked. On one wall inside his office hung a simple wooden frame containing 3 items that visitors always noticed before anything else. Inside rested an old employee identification badge, a carefully folded handwritten letter titled Things My Mom Never Put on Her Resume, and the colorful drawing Sophie had created with bright crayons. There was no expensive plaque beneath them, only a small engraved sentence that read, "Read the page everyone skipped." Every executive who entered the office eventually asked about the unusual display. Nathan always smiled before sharing the same answer. Those papers changed this company more than any business report ever has. Across the building, Olivia Bennett had become one of the most respected members of the customer experience team. Her coworkers admired her calm presence during difficult situations, her patience with frustrated clients, and her ability to make new employees feel welcome from their very first day. Many never knew the story behind her interview. They simply experienced the kindness she brought into every conversation. Sophie occasionally visited the office after school with permission from the reception staff, who now greeted her by name. She no longer walked through the front doors carrying fear inside her faded blue backpack. Instead, she carried library books, school projects, and the cheerful confidence of a child who believed adults really could keep their promises. One Friday afternoon, Nathan found her sitting quietly in the company cafe finishing her homework while Olivia completed a meeting nearby. He walked over carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, placing one gently beside Sophie. She looked up and smiled. Thank you. Nathan sat across from her. How is school? Sophie grinned. Pretty good. We learned that good questions are sometimes more important than quick answers. Nathan laughed softly. That sounds familiar. Sophie thought for a moment before asking, do people still get interviews even if they have empty years on their resume? Nathan nodded without hesitation. Every single one of them. He looked through the cafe windows toward employees walking across the courtyard below. Some of our best new team members almost never reached this building. We just did not know it yet. Sophie smiled proudly before opening her notebook. Tucked carefully between 2 pages was a copy of the letter she had written months earlier. The original remained safely framed in Nathan's office, but she had rewritten it in her own neat handwriting because, as she explained, some stories should always have another copy. Nathan looked at the little girl who had once walked into a room full of strangers carrying nothing but courage, a faded backpack, and faith in her mother's goodness. He realized that leadership was never simply about making the smartest decision. It was about creating a place where truth had the chance to be heard before judgment was made. As the afternoon sun settled across the Boston skyline, Nathan glanced once more toward the framed drawing waiting inside his office. A child's simple picture had become a daily reminder that the strongest companies were not built by finding perfect resumes. They were built by recognizing extraordinary people whose greatest qualifications could never fit inside a single document, because sometimes the most important page in someone's story is the one everyone almost forgets to read.